Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Episode 99, The English and French Revolutions, Part 2. In this fantastic collaboration with David Crowther of the History of England podcast, we continue where we left off, exploring these two monumental revolutions. Now, I did leave a little bit of a cliffhanger as we discuss how our new regimes replicated the worst aspects of the monarchies they replaced. So let's jump straight into it. Of course, if you're enjoying Grey History, then please support the show today at patreon.com. This leads us actually really well to the next question, because what we're talking about here is the inability of these revolutionary regimes to implement some of the values that they had championed years before. And we had a question from a listener, and this listener quoted historian David Starkey, who states that revolutions reproduce the worst aspects of the regimes they replace. And the listener wanted to know, what are some of the examples from our two revolutions where the new regimes replicate the faults of the old, or perhaps even exceed them? Do you want to take this one first, David? I mean, I can think of quite a few examples that you might bring to mind in terms of the crimes of Charles I that get replicated in various ways.
It's interesting. I kind of disagree with David Starkey because the context is always different. I think they create their own crimes, to be honest, their own, worst aspects of the regime. On toleration, the protectorate is always better until you get the Glorious Revolution. On censorship, there's quite a lot of backsliding, but it never gets back the High Commission and the Star Chamber, and so it's unable to implement censorship anything like the same scale as Charles I. But it invents its own horrors. So moral reformation, the rule of the major generals, the level of repression in Ireland by Charles Fleetwood and chums and the army until Henry Cromwell comes along, begins to moderate. But even so, the level of repression and land grab in Ireland is way worse than anything the Stuarts did. And it created its own evils of rule by the army, which will be a key factor in British politics for the next couple of hundred years. But the interesting thing is that in 1658, January 1658, there was no way back for the monarchy. The monarchy was gone. History, we are no longer a monarchy. That's it. It's all over. The people shouting, the fat ladies trying to sing, but, it's gone. And yet, 2 years later, it's back because of that factionalist and absolute unwillingness for anybody to compromise. So I disagree with David Starkey. I think they create their own nastinesses. Taxation, for example, is far higher, whether that's a good or a bad thing, at the end of the protectorate than ever Charles could have dreamt of. So that's a terrible answer, isn't it? But that is my answer.
I agree with you that Starkey's premise, for me, at least as it relates to the constitutional monarchy, I don't think that in the years between 1789 and 1792 that the new constitutional regime is simply replicating the worst aspects of the old regime. I think you need to kind of want to make that argument. I mean, you could make that argument in the sense of the dysfunction that the regime creates. I certainly think you could make that argument maybe in its tendency to go start international wars on very vague grounds like glory and honor. So you can make the argument, but I think, in general, if I look at the old regime and the constitutional monarchy, if I look at the inequality, the injustice, the lack of personal freedoms, I don't think that era is replicating the worst aspects. Having said that, I think Starkey's line rings a lot truer when we get to the Republican era, especially those initial years in 1792, 93, 94. That's a very different kettle of fish. If you think about the common criticisms of the old regime, the arbitrary arrests, the uneven justice, the censorship, the trampling of a range of individual rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, property rights, presumption of innocence. The list goes on. And under the reign of terror, or if I was to be a bit more generous, the era of revolutionary government, these abuses are often more severe than they had been under the monarchy. Now, there's good reason for this. France is besieged. It's got multiple civil wars. It's got foreign wars on all its land and maritime borders. There's reasons why things are worse. But that doesn't change the fact that the level of repression is far more extreme and individual liberties have been curtailed to a far greater extent in many ways than they had been under the old regime. Now, that's not a universal, I wouldn't say Starkey's line that all of the worst aspects are replicated. I mean, the French Republic does abolish slavery, for example. But as a general rule, I think that his line doesn't hold true to the constitutional monarchy, but it does hold true, at least for the initial years of the Republic, which then I suppose ends up getting back to dysfunction and corruption and some of the initial criticisms of the old regime in different regards.
Actually, on one minor point, it's worth saying Cromwell absolutely reproduces the faults of Charles in dissolving parliaments, although that was his job, and indeed Charles's job. But just like Charles, he struggles to get on with the parliaments that disagree with him. So for his point of view, because he's more tolerant than the parliaments are by and large. But anyway, so there is one thing I could give David Starkey his star for.
Fair enough. So I suppose we have hit perhaps with the most amount of questions that we got was on the topic we're about to go to next, which are the similarities and differences between these two great revolutions. And, I think it makes sense for people to want to understand where there are parallels, where there's divergence, because these are two monumental events that often get compared to one another. So I suppose, David, would you like to go first? We've obviously discussed religion to an extent already, but as it relates to other topics, would you like to start with the similarity or difference of your choice?
So I started off by thinking the dissimilarities are way greater than the similarities. And I think I probably stuck with that. But there are some very important similarities. So money, all about money. If Charles had had Cromwell's income, the Protectorate's income, he'd have crushed the Scots in 1637. We wouldn't be having this conversation probably. The English monarchy, the British monarchy, was radically underfunded, had been for years, and Parliament refused to accept that was the case. And that is the root cause of the problem. So money, and you talked about, the French being a bankruptcy crisis. So my first thing is money. Why don't you do a similarity?
I might cheekily give you a difference instead, because I agree that a fiscal crisis, the inability of the kings to raise the taxation that they require for different reasons, but an inability to raise sufficient taxation is a key similarity. But a difference is that economic crisis that we were talking about earlier. And the French, amongst other issues, they have had terrible harvests. They've had bad weather more broadly as well. And this creates a doubling of bread prices. This then feeds into the economy in all sorts of ways. And the French Revolution, throughout the entirety of the revolution, has these economic crises which are creating all sorts of problems. And it is no coincidence that at almost every major event that you get in the French Revolution, and particularly in Paris, it is sky-high bread prices. It feeds into everything. And it also it emerges in other ways. You have hyperinflation for a period of time. You have shortages in all sorts of basic goods and commodities. Some of it is, of course, self-inflicted. But this economic crisis is a big difference that manifests in different ways. And I suppose if I cheekily can sneak in a second difference between two groups that are often compared to one another, if you think about the sans-culottes and you think about the levelers, not the diggers, but the levelers, their economic policies, their economic manifestos, if you like, are very different. The sans-culottes are dealing into these economic crises, so they are far more collectivist in approach. They are after price maximums, price controls, not only on the cost of goods, but also wages. They are interested in all sorts of laws against speculation and hoarding. And if you go look at the manifestos produced by the levelers, they are champions of private property rights. And so this economic issue is a significant difference between the English and French revolutions and manifests in significant differences between groups that people often draw parallels between.
To build on that in another dissimilarity is the reason why people are, generally speaking, not allowed to call it the English Revolution, apart from the fact that it's clearly interconnected between the three kingdoms, is that there is very little social radicalism here. Nobody wants to recreate a new society. They want it better regulated with more liberties for people and freedoms, but they don't want to change the estates of man. There is none of that. So that's a key difference to me, which makes, we're going to come on to the radicalism question, which makes, for me, and I think most people, the English Revolution much less deeply radical than the French.
On the topic of kind of the radical nature of the revolutions, though, I do have a similarity which I'd like to throw it out there, which is how the radicalization of a armed group, particularly a group that's well represented in the capital, can really drive the broader revolution forward. This manifests in different ways. So if I think about England, obviously you have the new model army and everything to do with Pride's Purge and the trial of the king and the like. In France, the army does not play anywhere near the same role that it has. But what you do have in France, at least initially, is a new revolutionary militia known as the Parisian National Guard. And later on, you get the famous sans-culottes, which is, if I really simplify this, let's call them kind of like the militant wing of like a proto-working class. And the sans-culottes and the National Guard will start to become, those distinctions start to break down as the revolution continues, particularly in the Republican era. And in both cases, you have these well-coordinated and radical groups that are imposing their agenda on the elected legislative bodies, be it Parliament or the various French assemblies, and conducting things like purges of elected deputies or elected members of Parliament. And so for me, this is a key similarity where the revolutions are perhaps pushed much further than where the average citizen may be in their personal views because of a well-coordinated and well-armed group in the respective capitals.
Yeah, I think that's very true. The importance of the capital is also very strong, I think, very similar. I think it also leads on to other similarities, which neither group set out to create a republic. For both groups, they had a desire, though, to make a better world. And the engine to do that was a written constitution, which is a new idea. Both of them, it's less new in France, but, both of them said, right, we've got to write this down. We've got to regularize it, and we've got to live our lives by these set of agreed principles. So although there are far less, fewer radical, the radicalism is less in English, it still constitutes a major change in society, which people were aiming for, and they thought it was important mechanism was to write it down. So there's sort of a similarity there. And if I segue quickly into another similarity before you can open your mouth, because, my podcasts are crying out loud. For both, external factors are very important. I mean, external factors for England in terms of Ireland and Scotland in particular, but also France plays its part, and indeed Spain and the Netherlands. The international situation is important, or the external situation is very important. And that's clearly, I'd have thought, true for the French.
Yeah, so I would say that it's even more so for the French. I mean, at least from my perspective, if I look at the War of the Three Kingdoms, there is a significant amount of it that is conflict kind of within and between the kingdoms of the Stuart dynasty, or the realms of the Stuart kings. And so the French, I think comparatively, yes, they have civil wars, including a very notable civil war in Western France, but the French will find themselves at war with, at a single time, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, multiple Italian states, Spain, Portugal, eventually, like Russia gets into it. Like, you have foreign armies that are not only on French soil, but you've got multiple borders breached at any one time. The Prussians do start to get pretty close to Paris at one point. So for me, that foreign dynamic is incredibly important. And I do think there's a bit of a difference in the extent of that foreign element. But that also leads me to a similarity as well, which is just how important war is in these conflicts. And that creates similarities and differences in itself. The new model army is the new army. Like, There's all sorts of military reforms that come with this. There is similarities in the level of violence and how much of the needs of the state are kind of subordinated to the needs of the army and the needs of military victory. But there's also differences as well. The French are, I think, the foreign war is more important to them than the civil wars, where, obviously the English, they are in military engagements with the Spanish and the Dutch and the like, but by and large, it's kind of the war within and between, the three kingdoms that theoretically all have the same king.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And linked to that, actually, is in the English Revolution, there is no real desire to export this revolution. Certainly not in terms of the ideas. I know there's a war against Spain, but that's really a continuation of the Elizabethan War against Spain. And there's a little interesting wrinkle of the involvement in the Fronde in Bordeaux in 1650s when Edward Sexby gets sent over and takes the Agrément du Peuple with him. But basically, there's no desire to export, which brings me on to another question, actually, which I'm going to sneak in. So, the English narrative as a British narrative has always been about, Napoleon, destroyer of worlds. The French Revolution exported their revolution and took the war. They declared war on the Austrians for starters. And then they say, we need to convert the rest of Europe to these great new truths we found. And that's the main cause of the Napoleonic wars, as Napoleon's such glory. Whereas on our Facebook site, there was this idea suggested that, in actual fact, no, that's not true. Probably the Napoleonic Wars wouldn't have been necessary without British interference in French affairs. Discuss, Will.
What a simple question that you've got there for me, David.
Yeah, look, you've got 10 seconds. No, don't fashion in. Don't worry about it.
In a nutshell, yes, the French revolutionaries actively export their ideology to, they want to topple, and they make this very clear, they want to topple every throne in Europe. And so they are going to export the revolution at the point of a bayonet. And yes, okay, so by the time you get to the end of the War of the First Coalition, then you get Napoleon's takeover. I suppose if the guts of the question is, once Napoleon takes power in France and starts to consolidate the situation in France, if the pesky British hadn't been funding all these wars, would we still get, the Napoleonic Wars? I think we just get them in different flavour. Without the British, I don't think they would be as sizable, but, there are other great powers sitting at the table here. Austria is very unhappy with the settlement of the War of the First Coalition. They, at some point in time, are going to want to rewrite those treaties with a sword. There are other powers as well that have their nose out of joint. How much Britain is really going to sit on its hands when it views France as this ancient rival that it has been in conflict for centuries? We are in a period of time that some historians refer to as the Second 100 Years' War. So, do I think we still get some sort of Napoleonic Wars? Yes, especially with the fact that you've got Napoleon in charge. He's not exactly a sit-on-his-hands kind of guy. And likewise, I don't think that there's appetite in the halls of Parliament in the UK to just let the French and the Austrians, say, go at it and result in an even further French victory and kind of, an export of their power over the continent. So I think we're going to end up with some flavour of Napoleonic Wars, even if the Brits are sitting out a little bit more. I struggle to see a world where conflict ends in the late 1790s.
Well, next question we had was about the way the revolutions go. So the question is, why did the French Revolution encounter such difficult headwinds in terms of it ate its own children, was the phrase used in the question. Why was the English Revolution comparatively more stable? I've never really thought of the English Revolution as comparatively more stable. Eating children. Will, over to you.
So that line, just for context, there is a deputy that warns that the revolution will replicate Saturn, which is a reference to ancient mythology, and kind of devour its own children. And the revolution does do that. If I think about the National Convention, almost a third of deputies are arrested at some point in time between 1792 and 1795. Almost 10% will die from one means or another. So it is a revolution that is famous for killing its most prominent members. As to why the French Revolution becomes what it becomes, that is a question that historians have spent an enormous amount of ink trying to answer, and there is absolutely no consensus. I would offer just a few quick kind of highlights, I suppose, of that debate. The first thing that you need to understand is that the war is critical. The war begins in April 1792, just a few months before the fall of the monarchy. It is disastrous from the start. That discredits the pro-war revolutionaries, and it also discredits the monarchy, who is suspected of aiding the enemy, most notably the Austrians and the Prussians. And as I said, these military defeats helped to lead to the violent overthrow of the monarchy, and this process helps to reveal to the French people just how many people have been secretly betraying them. They have evidence that the king is secretly communicating with foreign monarchs. Lafayette, one of the great heroes of the initial years of the Revolution and a hero of the American Revolution, he attempts a coup to reverse the overthrow of the monarchy. Lafayette's replacement is a guy named de Maurier. He is initially considered the savior of the Republic for stopping the Prussian advance. He attempts a coup only a few months later. And you have other statesmen like Mirabeau, who was considered a champion of the people, and as part of the overthrow of the monarchy, secret documents reveal his double dealings as well. And so what you have with the war and what comes from it is military crises, as well as repeated instances of heroes being exposed as traitors. And you add on to this an atmosphere in the French Revolution of a culture that's kind of defined or obsessed by plots and conspiracies. And political leaders are starting to lose trust with their longtime friends and allies. They're suspicious of people that they even invited to their own wedding. And so all of a sudden, everyone is suspected of either secretly wishing to reinstall the monarchy, or to see themselves as a new Cromwell, or to enrich themselves through corruption through their political power. And so you have this, not only this military crisis, but this belief that no one can be trusted. Even the people that you thought were friends and men of virtue might actually be lying to you. Add on to that, the French have no history of kind of like parliamentary representative democracy or the like. And so what they don't really have a good grasp of, and it seems so odd in hindsight because of the societies that we live in, but they don't really have this grasp yet that people could represent the views of their constituents and have opposing views. So there's this idea that people are representing the will of the people. But if you have two individuals that say they're representing the will of the people and their views are polar opposite, then actually that person at best is misled. But actually, given everything else, they're probably a foreign agent. They're probably working for the royalists. They're probably, their intentions are, and it's not just that they're wrong, it's that they are betraying the people. And so all of this kind of comes together, and you add in issues around structural weakness, as I said before, the hunger crises, economic crises, destabilizing factors around the sheer size and scope of the revolutionary agenda. And all of a sudden, as the war gets worse and worse, and as civil war starts to break out, then, you have grounds to suspect everyone. And because they've killed Louis, then the only treatment that they have for these people that they are accusing of treason must also be death. You couldn't possibly kill Louis XVI and then spare elected deputies. The revolution starts to consume itself. Now, for some historians, they also point to the fact that the revolution's underlying ideology is inherently violent, it's inherently unstable. It was always going to result in the terror, even from 1789. Other historians would vehemently disagree with that and mainly point to the war and the situation that the war creates. But as I said, historians have spent an awful lot of time debating this, but I think that gives you a sense of how different factors around this environment of paranoia and fear and suspicion meets with a military crisis, meets with unrest and hunger and the like, and all of a sudden you get all these things that come together to create a perfect storm.
Very interesting. I mean, fascinating topic there. So I've been much briefer with English. I don't quite know. For me, you've said one of these, that the respect of Parliament is incredibly strong, and therefore there was a forum where people think these things should be worked through. And even throughout Cromwell's years, he never tries to rule without Parliament. He keeps having parliaments. And secondly, the stakes were so much lower in the English Revolution. There wasn't all this rampant inequality, was far less. Social mobility was far higher. There was no famine. There were, the economic reasons weren't there. There was no external war. So all those things were less powerful. And throughout it, everybody keeps saying, "Oh, this is awful. This is awful." Nobody's celebrating the change. They're saying, "This is terrible. We need to get back to where we were when everything was cuddly and we all had teddy bears." They're constantly doing that. Nobody's rollicking. Very few people are rollicking in the change. A few people, but really, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things in our discussions that has become apparent is just how different these revolutions are, even though that they have parallels. Well, they do have a range of similarities and they do have parallels, especially on the surface as well. They are very different beasts. And that's part of the reason why not only their cause, but also, I suppose, the kind of the middle chapters, if you like, do develop in very different ways.
Which brings us to the next question, which was, for me, was the most interesting one that I want to hear you give me the answer. So quite a few people asked the questions of how much influence you think the British Revolution was on the French, whether the leaders of the French Revolution were inspired by the English one. Can we quantify the degree of influence? Were there any positive references, inspirations from the English Revolution? So I'm really interested in this. Will, go.
So I think the overall influence of the English Revolution on the French is probably less than is commonly assumed, and much of it's indirect. I mean, yes, Britain is held up as an example amongst reformers before they even know that there's going to be a revolution. Britain is held up as an example of constitutional monarchy, but it's not the only example that's championed. You've got to remember that some of the French revolutionaries are actively involved in the American Revolutionary War, and many of the French intellectual elite are looking over as America as an example. They see Britain as corrupted and not necessarily representing a lot of the values from the Enlightenment. And that's another factor. Yes, again, the British example is looked upon positively by many French Enlightenment thinkers. But there are many thinkers in the Enlightenment, and, the British example is, there's a whole bunch of ideas that the French are drawing upon, and it's not just the British parliamentary system. And I think the proof as to why this positive influence, if you like, is actually relatively limited occurs in late 1789, when the revolutionaries kind of have established themselves after the fall of the Bastille, and they can start to draft a constitution. And when the French actually start to draft the constitution, they look at the English model and bin it. They run in the opposite direction. They're not going to have a House of Lords. They're not going to let the King's ministers be members of the Legislative Assembly. They're not going to allow the King to appoint a whole series of positions. They're going to be elected. They look at the British constitutional model and they see in it all sorts of inequalities and corruptions and distortions of the people's will, and create something that is quite different, not only from the British model, but also from what many of the American states, as well as, the American federal government has established as well. And so to me, I think that's, it kind of goes back to what we were discussing with the trial of Charles and Louis, where the French in many ways are looking over at the English and going, here's what we're not going to do. I think you could argue it was a mistake doing that, and certainly that's what Edmund Burke argues. The influence is there, but I think it's limited. And the final point I would make is that these revolutions are very different. If you think about the English Revolution, you've got religious issues with Scotland and the like. That results then in a broader civil war. And then only after that do you get a revolution. Where the French, you start off with a bankruptcy, then you get a revolution, then you get foreign war and some religious tensions before another revolution, and only then do you get to a civil war. Like they're very different in their structure and their causes. And that limits the kind of applicability, if you like, of what lessons you can take. So in short, yes, there is definitely a positive impact and influence and indirect source of inspiration from aspects of the British constitutional model. But the French are not taking notes and going, this is what we need to replicate. That's not the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's quite interesting. It's quite depressing, actually, when you try and trace the influence of the English Revolution in England, in Britain. It's actually quite hard work. So the thing that we would like to think, that, these leveler ideas and digger ideas of democracy and communality and, blah, 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 start a movement. Really not true. Shaftesbury carries on the green ribbon thing around the levelers for a little while. You can argue that the English Revolution inspires Locke, who is one of the fathers of the Enlightenment, but it's a little bit tangential. So yes, I mean, I agree. I think people, there are lots of impacts of the English Revolution in Britain, but they tend to be not about let's have democracy, which we would like them to be. They're things like religious pluralism is here to stay, the king can be killed, and therefore you've got to watch that again, and so on and so forth. But actually that leads us on, in a sense, to the next question, which is, to what extent did the French understanding of the 1688-1689 rebellion, the Glorious Revolution, how did that influence France? Is your answers presumably pretty much the same?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. I think what's really impacting the French far more than the British examples is actually the Enlightenment. And so there's a whole bunch of ideas that come out of the English Civil War that feed, as you say, into various Enlightenment thinkers on both sides of the Channel and across the continent. But the French really aren't doing a kind of play-by-play reading of English history and going, this is the lesson, this is what's right or wrong. It's much bigger than that. And it's a bit more of a butterfly effect where ideas are coming through the Enlightenment. We've got to keep in mind that even with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that is 100 years before the French Revolution. It is a very long time. No one has lived that experience or the like. And so, again, the impact of all the mid-1600s in England, from the 1640s towards the 1670s, the impact, I think, is relatively indirect. And it is impactful, but not in people just reading the history books and going, this is the problem. With the exception of, certainly there are aspects that are much more literal, like the trial of Charles I, or how do we avoid a Cromwell dictatorship. Those examples are being discussed, but even then they're being discussed in relation to, like if you read the debates of the French Revolution, it's like you can play ancient Rome and ancient Greece bingo, and you can barely go a couple of hours without other history being referenced. And so England is only part of a much broader conversation of historical references and learnings.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is quite interesting that the Glorious Revolution in particular does codify some of this into a Bill of Rights with a limitation of king's power, of the separation of power between the king and judiciary, the idea of a certain level of religious toleration. So there is some of that, but I agree, it's all at one remove. It's influences the Enlightenment. And one of the big differences in the English Revolution is the Enlightenment hasn't happened. This is all new. There's no roadmap, as I said. So yeah, agreed. And I think we had another couple of questions. So Louis XVI had benefit of hindsight. He knew what happened to Charles I. I think you've already covered that actually earlier in the trial. And then how did the Brits explain away their revolution during the 1790s? Why didn't we say, oh yeah, this is what we should have done first time? You've answered the question about did they French look at 1640s and 50s as a model, and said no, basically agree. So how did the Brits explain it away? Why did we suddenly start getting all so antsy about the French Revolution? And I think we've come back to Burke, don't we? That he's feeling that we had a constitution which had evolved, which reflected the spirit of the people and was continuing to reflect that populist sovereignty, that idea which had come up in the first English Revolution. Popular sovereignty was actually being reflected in an organic process and growing, and that there was bound to be violence if you just tried to write it down in one set of paper, because people are always things are going to change and people are going to disagree and all the rest of it. And of course, he was absolutely right. The French Revolution did blow up, and, changing constitutions is very tricky. So I think we explained it away because we thought, in the petite English arrogant fashion, we've got it right. Obviously, the Chartists would change all that, but...
Yeah, and to go further, Burke kind of ends up with these really interesting kind of theoretical arguments where the French are basing their constitutions off natural rights. Burke is proposing these ideas known as like ancient rights, and that these are kind of slow incremental change based on what's been accepted, like the inherited wisdom of your ancestors. And of course, there's contradictions in this. Burke doesn't really try to explain where these ancient rights come from, and there's other issues. But on this point of how the Brits kind of explain away their revolution when they're looking at the French Revolution and horror, the last time I made an appearance on the History of England podcast, I kind of got into this explicit question around British reactions to the French Revolution. So that's a whole episode, and I would definitely check that out to get into the nuts and bolts of why Burke crafted an argument that would simultaneously let him defend English history and the English approach while also raining on the parade of the French, which, as you say, David, there's many criticisms of Burke's work, but his predictions on the fact that the French Revolution will devour itself and fail, he is on the money.
Yes, it's an excellent episode. You should absolutely go. I'll repost it, actually, when we've done this. So we've kind of reached the end, amazingly. I reflect, actually, in the way that every revolution is flawed, the very idea of a podcast as Q&A is deeply flawed. It has the seeds of its own destruction in it, because podcasters like to talk. Anyway, I mean, it's impossible. That's why we do it, because we like the sound of our own voices. And so we've gone on for hours. Anyway, we agreed that we would kind of sum up and have our top 3 similarities and top 3 dissimilarities. So, you first.
Oh, God, this is the part where I confessed that I haven't actually come up with a solid list. So I think the top 3 similarities, I think the fiscal crisis has to be one. The need for the monarchs to raise taxes and how that then opens up Pandora's box as to, well, what is actually the prerogatives and the power of the king versus an elected assembly and the constitutional arrangements of that. So I think that's one clear similarity. Another similarity, I think, is the importance of war in shaping these revolutions and defining their quite violent characteristics at times. And a third top similarity would be, you know what, I'll go back to what I was saying before, where a well-armed and well-coordinated radical minority can push the revolution to a far greater extent than actually what many people are comfortable with, particularly in this case where both nations have such a metropolis for a capital, where the role of London and particularly the role of Paris is just so pronounced over their respective kingdoms. And yourself, David?
Yes, I'm going to agree with all of those similarities, and I'm not going to argue with any of them or introduce some new ones, particularly about the money one. So I'll do dissimilarities then, and you can see how much you argue with those. My dissimilarities, first of all, start off with the Enlightenment. And one of the really exciting things about the English Revolution, actually, and it doesn't happen in the same way in Scotland and Ireland, is they're starting from scratch. There's no roadmap. They're making it up as they go along, and the profusion of ideas that comes out of the revolution is the most thrilling thing out, from Gerald Winstanley and the Common Treasury all the way through to natural rights, popular sovereignty of the people. All this fantastic stuff. I didn't go anywhere, obviously, but, So that would be my first big dissimilarity. The level of social revolution, I think, is critical to how it all turns out. There isn't that critical bite to it. And then finally, the influence of religion is absolutely different in the English Revolution.
I would agree with all of that. I know we said top 3, but I would add into that the economic crises and the way that permeates a rejection of all sorts of values. Even initially, in the French Revolution, they're abandoning the kind of old way of doing things in the monarchy and introducing quite radical ideas around private property rights and freedom of trade and the like. And that all gets binned a few years later because of the economic crises and how that powers further instability and rebellion in Paris. So that's a key difference I would also add.
Great. Are we done then, Will? Can we finally release our poor listeners? Have we delighted them enough?
Well, I think we can. And, I think everyone still has their heads. David, thank you so much for helping to make this Q&A possible. It has been fantastic. For the benefit of my listeners, do you want to maybe just give a quick summary of what you're doing over at, admittedly, the relatively self-explanatory, the history of England, but perhaps maybe explain the sheer size and scale of what you're up to over there?
Oh, well, we're doing a sort of soup to nuts history of England. We are currently at 1660. I've taken a pause just because, I wanted to. But we're getting back on with the later Stuarts very soon, in a couple of months' time. And Will, equally, let all my listeners know, although you've been on the programme already, actually, did that fantastic episode on Burke, which was brilliant, actually. Yes, you want to tell my listeners what it is you're about?
It's also pretty self-explanatory. The French Revolution and Napoleon by Grey History. We are, in a very similar manner, slowly, chronologically working our way through the French Revolution. We are in the height of the terror at the moment, so there's plenty to catch up on, and it's all happening. And yeah, if you're looking for a long-form history to sink your teeth into, by all means, come check it out.
And I think actually one thing to add to that, if I may, there is a commonality between us, Will, which comes out of your name, Grey Histories, which is that we both believe these things. History is all incredibly nuanced. There is no right or wrong. It's very difficult to find rights and wrongs. Obviously, there are some. And that's the excitement of history, getting inside the heads of the people and their attitudes from the past, rather than going back and saying, look, this is the way they should have been. Aren't they awful? So I think we both believe it, love it, the complexity and nuance of history, do we not?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, history, as the reason why it's called Grey History. History isn't black and white. It's full of ambiguity. It's full of nuance. And, as I like to say, we've got no shortage of problems we need to solve in the 21st century. And so we might as well try to learn some of the lessons of the past. And if we're to do that successfully, then we need to understand the contradicting experiences and conclusions, not only of contemporaries, but also of historians as well, and why people look at the same events or experience the same events and can come to different conclusions. I think that's what gives history its richness and its colour. So yes, I couldn't agree more.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Will, for all the organisational work you've done and agreeing to do the editing. Thank you very much indeed. And yeah, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening to episode 99, The English and French Revolutions, Part 2. Make sure you check out The History of England wherever you get your podcasts. Next episode, we return to Paris to see the rise of the Committee of Public Safety, from revolutionary government and foreign plots to the infamous de-Christianization campaign. The next several episodes, well, I hope you're ready for one wild adventure. But before you go, I could really use your help. If you're enjoying Grey History, please support the show today at patreon.com. For just a coffee or two a month, you can do your part to keep this show on the air, and there's plenty of perks in doing so. So please go to patreon.com right now, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Kevin S., and Griff. Joining the amazing heroes are the fantastic champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, Sophia, Kevin, Scott, Jersey, Alvaro, Eric, and the whole country of Luxembourg.